I gave you guys the post-it. So what I want you to do is we need to vote on the class representatives. Alicia right here is going to be one of our representatives, and Simon is going to be the other. What you're going to do is you're going to write the name of one person, and then I'm going to collect the ballots, and as a democracy, we're going to vote on who we want as our class representative. Yenay, thank you. And if it is for Alicia, it will be a tie-breaking vote. If not, the tie will go to Simon. So, Simon, as a class representative, you were voted.
The act of casting a ballot that gets counted on election day is the nation's great equalizer because it is one of the few instances in which our voice, opinions, and the legacy we seek to leave future generations readily crosses the expansive divide that is race and class in this country. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed into law to stop the voter disenfranchisement of people of color in the United States, specifically in the southern United States.
The efforts to get the nation's attention really culminated with the events at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where a group of activists tried to march from Selma to Montgomery in behalf of voting rights, and were met by the Alabama State Police, who beat them and stopped them. Eventually, after going to federal court, the march came off and was a great focus of national attention. Shortly thereafter, Lyndon Johnson took up the idea of passing voting rights legislation and made it happen in quite dramatic fashion in 1965.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, and still considered, one of the landmark civil rights victories of the modern civil rights movement. And what it sought to do is ban discrimination on the grounds of race for voting. So it was meant to finally stamp out a lot of the practices that have been used not only in the southern United States, but throughout the country to prevent mostly people of color and African Americans from voting.
So as an educator, the dismantling of the Voter Rights Act of 1965 was a huge blow to American democracy. I think that in the classroom, we teach it as a piece of landmark legislation, a turning point in the history of our democracy.
So there's an actual prohibition against racial discrimination, which is Section 2, but then there are also other tools that they use within the Voting Rights Act to make sure that where it was discrimination was most prevalent be addressed. So for example, one of the most controversial provisions was Section 5, which you might be aware essentially required certain states to run by their new voting laws with the federal government because they had a history, like a particularly bad history, of voter discrimination for people of color.
In 2006, Congress went through an extensive process. It compiled a 15,000-page record documenting the continuing need for pre-clearance.
And so the whole story of how it was achieved is an integral part of our history as well. That has basically now by Congress it's been suggested that doesn't really, doesn't matter either.
The challenge in Shelby was to Section 5, and what the Supreme Court said is, like, you're right, like that formula doesn't quite work anymore, and there's not nearly as much evidence of this sort of discrimination that once existed in the 60s and before as there is now. So we're essentially going to gut this, and it's a little, it's a little more technical than that, but they essentially gutted that section, and by saying, we don't think it works, Congress, go fix it.
So if Congress wants to resuscitate pre-clearance, it needs to come up with a new coverage formula. It also needs to think about other ways to strengthen the Act in case the new coverage formula is not sufficient to do what the old coverage formula did. and to ensure that voting rights are protected.
Even today, it's not just the South. There are voting irregularities, and minorities, especially African Americans and people who are immigrants, are still often denied the right to vote. And we see irregularities. We see that process being played out, and it's pretty scary. And so I think that the need for federal protection, you could still make the case for it today.
Texas immediately announced that it would put its photo ID law into effect. That had been blocked under Section 5. And North Carolina passed truly draconian new constraints on voting, including a photo ID law, but also cutting back on early voting and making registration less available. All measures that are designed to reduce participation in the electoral process. Those are things that pretty certainly would have been blocked under Section 5 that can now go into effect, and I think we're going to see it happening in other jurisdictions.
We do need Congress to revisit the Voting Rights Act and revise the part that was declared impermissible by the Supreme Court decision, so that we can make sure that voters everywhere in the country who are at risk of racial discrimination are able to be given the kinds of protections that they deserve under the Constitution.
I think the Voting Rights Act has made a difference. We are a better nation because they have been in place, but now is not the time to take them away. I think having them in place and ensuring that they are carried out and executed is what will continue to ensure that the United States stays on that right paved road.
We have far to go before we actually complete the project of having our democracy be fully accessible by everyone.
It is your job to vote. It is your responsibility, your right, and your privilege.